The Aero Precision EPC. Small caliber, huge impact. There is a dick joke in that, okay? So, these are pistol caliber carbine, 9mm. It's the new Aero Precision upper, lower, barrel, and bolt carry group, and buffer and spring. So, we have two different guns here, clearly. This one right here is a customer's of ours that he's gracefully let me use it. And this is essentially set up as a stock Aero Precision build, okay? This one right here is a 16-inch. This is an 8-inch. This 16-inch, I used the Aero Precision upper and lower receivers, and I used a whole bunch of aftermarket parts on it. The reason being is I wanted to see how well it was going to work with aftermarket parts and test it to set up and shoot with those in comparison to what Aero has. We test a lot of products here. This is definitely no different than all the rest of them. They're fairly new. We've only sold about a dozen of them so far, but what we've seen so far we like quite a bit. The biggest issue that we find when it comes to the 9mm AR platform is the dimensions on how the magazine fits, okay? So you can see this one's a little bit sloppy up and down. That's fine though. That's tight enough to where your tolerances are okay. Dimensionally, your magazine has to work in these properly or it will never run correctly no matter what you do. So the angle of the magazine, as you can see this one's tilted back, is correct. And it has to be the correct angle as it's going into the receiver or it'll feed too high or feed too low. Same thing with the depth. If it's too low or too high, it'll feed in the incorrect area and it won't hit the forcing cone. So the other thing that we see is the magazine release, okay? The magazine release has to be in the right spot so that the magazine is not too low and is locking in the right place reliably. This one actually works extremely well. The magazines fall out no problem, okay? Both of them have worked with both factory and Magpul magazines. They don't like the KCIs. I have a couple of KCI 33 rounders and they don't really like to feed them. I think the dimensions are just a little bit off, and once again, the dimensionality of that magazine feeding into that single hole barrel is really important. So, of all of these parts, they all function extremely well. They're all very reliable. So the big difference between the bolt carrier groups that I'm using here is this one's clearly an aftermarket. This one's the Aero. The Aero, the gas key is a little bit longer, but it's recessed into the actual top of the bolt. This is really good. There's a lot of lateral stress that happens when you fire these. A lot of people think they just go back and forth and this is just a little kite that holds it in place. It's not true. The gun is actually torquing every time it fires and it puts a lot of lateral stress on these bolt heads. So we see these snap off. Having it recessed into the bolt like this and adding extra strength, stopping it from doing that, great idea, and I love it. They're using a much more beefier extractor, and you can see that the extractor has got a soft spring in it. That's exactly what you want. You don't want a super tight extractor spring on these. It needs to be soft. You're dealing with a different type of cartridge, a different type of system than an AR-15. So it needs that. It needs to be beefy so that it's not going to break, but at the same time be really loose like that. So good on them. This is the weight on the back of it, and it's actually a part of the length, held in place by a roll pin here that goes all the way through. This is fairly common, and we see this on other ones. Adding it as a total weight allows them to add more weight. I don't know if I'm a big fan of that yet. It's not bad, but at the same time, we do see these roll pins break sometimes, and it does cause a little bit of movement in there, but it does allow you to get your weight up. So these operating systems need to be worked at about 18 to 20 ounces of weight. So the next thing that we're using that's a little bit different is on the 16-inch here. I'm using a Blitzkrieg hydraulic, and I believe this is the heavyweight. I don't remember. I have both of them. I also have the spare weight. I'm running it without the weight and just a regular heavy hydraulic. It's a longer system. These are made for the 9 mils, and I'm using a JP 308 carbine spring. This is their buffered spring, not the silent captured spring system, just a 308 carbine spring. What Aero uses is a basic solid weight with a 308 carbine spring. The 308 carbine spring is your go-to when it comes to working these systems. There are a shit ton of different buffer systems out of there. If you're not sure what to use and you don't want to experiment, this is fine. It's a more harsh recoil with this than it is with this. When I was shooting this I could run exceptionally faster and had a lot less dot movement with it, simply because the recoil was being transferred over a longer amount of time, and we're talking about hundreds of seconds of time, okay? And because you're transferring that energy over a longer period of time, it changes the way that the recoil feels. It doesn't change the amount of recoil that you have, but it definitely changes the way that it feels and the amount of movement. The amount of movement in the gun, which is the most important for these when you're shooting competitively. So it's very slippery. We use grease on them. So I definitely prefer this system so far, but this is extremely reliable. There's no moving parts. It's a very solid weight. It has a good bumper on it, and it's using the right spring. This comes in their EPC kit. It's a good choice when you're first starting off. If you're going to use it competitively, it's time to look and experiment with some other systems. The Blitzkrieg hydraulic buffers and the Taccom buffers are the two that I've played with extensively, and they are both very good. I do not recommend the JP silent captured spring for this system. It's too small a spring, the weights are too thin, and this is just too violent in action, and we see problems with them. So I just don't recommend those in these. Stay with either the Blitzkrieg or the Taccom. They seem to work the best. So I used a QC10 barrel, and this one is using the Ballistic Advantage made barrel for Aero Precision. I'm not a fan of the Ballistic Advantage barrel, and the reason being, and I'll post some pictures as we're talking about this, the reason being is right in here there is not enough forcing cone diameter cut into it to really feed as well, and you'll get jams where it hits the forcing cone, and the forcing cone angle it's too acute. So instead of having a really egregious forcing cone, right, or something that's probably going to be really good and not give you all kinds of problems when it comes to guppying your brass, they have this really tight angle on there, and what happens is you can actually hit it with a bullet and it'll get jammed in here. So there is a fix for it, and it's called ramping into the forcing cone, and that's what I've done on this one. Is I've actually ramped it, and it now feeds 100%. But previous to that, the owner of this firearm had massive amounts of feeding issues, and that's regardless of the ammunition. It's the forcing cone's just cut wrong, and I really hope that Aero and Ballistic go back and they look at that and they go to a more aggressive forcing cone. The quarter circle 10 ramp is much better beveled, and it runs 100%. So do I recommend the BA barrel? It shoots fine. It's very accurate, but you're probably going to have to find somebody to ramp the barrel for you if you start having feeding issues, which I suspect you will. I really hope that Ballistic Advantage and Aero Precision address this issue and change the dimensions on that and the roundness of it so that it feeds better. It's just other companies have figured it out there. They run 100%. They need to get that squared away. So overall, as a whole, what we're seeing from the Aero Precision production for their uppers and their lowers is very good. I'm actually very happy that we have a quality 9mm product for upper and lower receivers from a company that's producing them on a regular basis with good dimensions on them. It's really kind of difficult to find, and a lot of companies phone it in. We've seen some of the companies that the dimensions for the mag, they're terminal. They'll never ever run properly. These will, and that was the big difference, and that was why we wanted to test them so much. When it comes to aftermarket components, I have had no problems using aftermarket components on the 16-inch. Clearly the QC10 barrel went in just fine. I have not tested a Taccom barrel yet. I may in the future. I don't suspect I'll have any problems. I used a Stag handguard on this one just because we had some sitting around. Stag is another company that's co-owned by Aero Precision and Ballistic Advantage, and so everything matches up really well. I suspect you could use any handguard that you wanted on this and it would be no problem. But it's working well with aftermarket buffers. It's working well with an aftermarket bolt carrier group. It's working well with a Hyperfire trigger. We've used both the Radian and the Noveskes for safety selectors. We've used multiple parts and components. These are CMMG pins. These are the actual Aero pins. They all seem to be compatible and working, which means they're staying within military specification for most of the components that it should fit. One thing to note, the way that this mag catch works on these right here is this piece of wire right here. Okay, so as the mag pushes up on this pushes out, and it pushes your mag catch out and locks your bolt open, or sorry, your bolt catch. Because of that and the way that that wire works, we found that a normal paddle like this will not, with a bad lever, will not fit properly. It's too tight with that wire. So the Phase 5 does work, and we have successfully used this on a couple of guns so far. So if you're looking for that battery assist device, which I do that on a lot of my competition guns, go with the Phase 5 and skip the mag pull. It's just not gonna fit as well. Short of that, I'm seeing the same amount of accuracy out of both of these. The accuracy from the barrels is really good. As long as you keep your reciprocating mass in the 18 to 22 ounces, preferably 18 to 20 ounces, your system is going to run with 9mm just fine. If you're running it with a suppressor, then go to the 20 to 22 ounce range and you'll be just fine. This, with their 7.5 ounce buffer, is roughly in the 20 ounce range. So this Taccom with this Blitzkrieg is in the 17.5, 17 3/4 ounce range. So it's right there on the edge. It's running a little fast, but once again, it's still within tolerance. I'm not having out of battery discharge problems, and it's working just fine. I will play this with heavier systems as we go along in different types of buffer and spring systems to see how well it works with those aftermarket products too. But based on how much experience we have with 9mm ARs here, I suspect it's going to work just fine, because we're not seeing all of the little bugs that we do in some of the other firearms when it comes to dimensionality in the receiver. This is the most important part for dimensionality when it comes to AR-9s running properly and feeding properly. The second thing is the barrel. We've already talked about it here. Everything else, pretty much good to go. So as it stands, initial review, definitely a thumbs up on the parts and components. They're made with some thought. They're made with somebody who actually shoots these in mind. The way that they bolt their bolts, and the bolt carrier group itself is actually pretty stout, and I like to see that. But either of these will work. Definitely to recommend at this point.